All right, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thank you very much to Matt and Andrea for hosting this webinar that they've been doing every year. I think it's a great way to get information out to growers, especially before we start the season. And that's sort of what I tried to gear my presentation towards today, because we're getting into the time of year when people are going to start spraying. And so I just wanted to share the latest research coming out of my lab. But before I get started, I definitely want to acknowledge my co-authors. This is a peer-reviewed paper that's currently under review, but it's a project that several of us worked on together. Luis Aristizabal, Colby Maeda, Tracy Matsumoto, all helped in various aspects of this project, and we're all critical to coming out with a really good study that I'm happy to share with you all today. So we're going to talk about fungicide efficacy and duration of protection for CLR in Hawaii. Before I jump into the main project, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the ongoing monitoring that we've been doing. Luis and I started monitoring back in January 2021, so pretty much right after rust was discovered in Maui and then on the Big Island. And we that first year we followed more than 30 farms, but since that time we've been following 14 farms more consistently. And so this graph shows data from those 14 farms averaged over time. The blue line shows Kona and the orange line shows Ka'u. And what's really striking to me is that we're sort of seeing the same pattern in CLR incidents year after year. We all know that our weather varies a little bit, and it certainly varies from farm to farm. But we are seeing pretty consistent patterns, and they're consistent in both districts and across elevations. So typically we see lowest infection during the spring months, so from March to June, and then we start to see infection increase as we get into July, and then it really takes off into the harvest and then peaks sort of in that post-harvest. So right about now is probably when you're seeing your highest infection. I want to point out, and this is going to be a theme throughout the project, and you've probably heard Lisa Keith talk about it and Andrea talk about it many times, that CLR is easiest to manage if you are starting the season with a really low incidence, so like less than 5%. That's going to be really critical to all of these products that I'm going to talk about today. They're going to work the best if you start low and continue low throughout the season. We sort of have these arbitrary categories for what, infection levels are, and there's no hard and fast rule to this. I think everybody's threshold for what their infection is going to be varies. If you're a conventional farm, maybe you can keep your incidence at 5% or below, but if you're organic or a year-round farm that harvests throughout the year, and you're not able to use the translaminar Preaxor, which I'm going to talk more about, your threshold might be higher. Maybe your threshold is more like 10 or 15%. So I just wanted to show you sort of what these rough ranges might look like, and then also point out that 5% range, we're really only there for a very short period of time from year to year, right? You see that we are in the 5% range really only during the spring months. And then the rest of the year, our infection has been really, really high. So that was sort of one of the things that we wanted to get at with this study, is how do we get these infection levels lower and down into that 5 to 10% range so that they can be managed more effectively. So we've talked a lot in different presentations about ways to manage CLR, and Andrea has a ton of good information on her website. And you've heard from a number of scientists on all of these different factors that you can use together to control CLR on your farms. That includes starting the year with pruning and then doing some nutrient testing for both your soils and your leaves, applying fertilizer based on those results, monitoring for rust, especially in the early part of the year, controlling weeds, and then applying fungicides. Today, I'm going to focus on fungicide applications, but it's important to realize that all of these things need to be done together to really effectively control rust. So one thing that has stood out to Luis and I is that during our surveys over the years, we've definitely noticed that growers are making a lot of improvements in the way that they manage CLR. We're seeing that people are pruning better. They're starting to get used to taking soil and leaf tissue samples. They're fertilizing more. Maybe they're using some foliar fertilizers, which might be new for them. So they're doing a lot of things which are really good. And a lot of them are also consistently applying fungicides, which is great to see. But we're still getting really high levels of rust, like 30, 50, 70%, pretty consistently at the end of the year. So why is this? Why is it that all these farms that look like they're doing a really good job in management, why are we seeing such varying levels and often very high levels of infection? And in the picture here, you can see that high infection results in very high defoliation. So if you drive around Kona right now, you'll see a lot of farms have no leaves on their lower and mid branches. And a lot of those branches are probably dead and they're probably never going to produce fruit again. So you're left with sort of these bare trees. They're only going to produce at the very top. So the grower has to make a decision of what they're going to do. Are they just going to leave the tree like that and suffer that sort of production loss? Or are they going to stump or prune really heavy? You know, some decisions have to be made. Because ultimately, if you end up with really high defoliation because you had very high infection, like 50, 70% at the end of the year, that subsequent year, you're going to see a big decrease in production. So we really wanted to get at a better understanding of which fungicides work the best in our conditions here in Hawaii. We have a number of different fungicides approved, and they probably all have different levels of efficacy and also duration of protection. So this isn't an exhaustive list. These are just some of the fungicides that are approved for use on coffee in Hawaii. Andrea has a really nice handout on her website that has a more exhaustive list of everything approved. And it's also really nice because it shows you which ones are compatible with Bavaria, which is important to consider and we'll talk more about later. These are the big groups. Serenade and double nickel are really commonly used on a lot of our farms. They're what we would maybe term a biological, and they have bacillus, different species of bacillus as their active ingredient. In the blue, we have a number of different coppers. There's a lot more coppers out there that are approved for coffee than this. These are just some of the more common ones that we see used on farms. And most of these have just a single copper ingredient, but I do want to point out that Badge is unique in having 2 different copper ingredients, and that's going to be really important later on in the presentation, so keep that in mind. The Problab Verde is what we would call a botanical-based fungicide, so it's made from the extract of Lupinus albus, and it is marketed as a translaminar with preventative and curative properties. Oxidate is pretty unique. I don't think we have any other products like it out there that are approved. It's a combination of hydrogen dioxide and peroxyacetic acid. We did not test this in this field trial, but I will talk more about it and when I think it could be useful later on. And then lastly, we have Preaxorzemium, and that is a translaminar. Not a true systemic, which I often hear people term it, and that's not the case. It's a translaminar, meaning that you have to make contact with the leaf, and then within that leaf, the fungicide will spread. But it's not going to spread throughout the whole plant, which is what a true systemic does. We do have some true systemics that are being tested, and I think some are having good results in both the lab and field, and we're looking forward to some of those being approved. I think Abound is one of them. But what we have for now is this translaminar Preaxor, and it's, again, got 2 ingredients. These strobins, pyraclostrobin, it's a type of strobin, and those tend to be really effective for managing rust. So 2 groups, I guess you could say. One group, the biological and coppers, are preventatives, and they tend to work the best at very low levels of rust, so like less than 5%. And then these other 3, which are marketed as preventatives and also curatives, so they should prevent future infection if applied correctly with good coverage and at the right time of year. But they can also cure any existing infection that you might have. So just some terms to keep in mind as we move forward here. So our study goals, we wanted to evaluate the efficacy of some of these preventative and curative fungicides that are on the market under different varying environmental conditions in Hawaii coffee farms. And then in addition to efficacy, we wanted to look at the duration of protection that each of these fungicides provides. And we also wanted to estimate the cost so that growers can take that into account when deciding on their spray rotation. So I wanted to show you what some of the characteristics of these study farms look like. So we did the study in 2022 and 2023, and some of the farms were included in both years, but some were just included in a single year. We had 1 farm in Hilo, 3 in South Kona, and then 2 in Ka'u. Elevation range from 427 up to 588 meters. The average annual temp range from 19 to 22 degrees. Relative humidity, the average annual range from 84 to 93. And then cumulative rainfall range from 900 millimeters all the way up to almost 3,000 millimeters. So pretty big difference. And of course, Hilo is the rainiest. And then size of the farms, they range from 1 to 2 acres. The inclination, we just wanted to show sort of the steepness of the farms, which was also pretty variable. So some were quite flat, maybe around 3%, and then some were quite steep, 15 to 18%. All the farms had Typica planted, and they varied in age from 5 all the way up to 30 years old. And then they also varied in planting density. So 650 trees per acre, all the way up to 900 trees per acre. So each study plot was divided into these different treatment blocks, which consisted of 100 to 200 trees. And then we assigned just 1 fungicide randomly to each treatment block. And each treatment consisted of multiple rows, which is shown on in the figure on the right, and count for spray drift. And I think the picture too also shows sort of variation in the trees. So the one on the right, you could see some farms had really bushy trees or planted really close together, and other farms, they had pruned pretty heavily and the trees were more spindly. And these are the fungicides that we included in the trials. So we had 2 biologicals. Again, these are bacillus-based, Serenade and double nickel. We had 2 coppers, Badge X2 and Fungicide 3000, 2 coppers. And then Problad Verde, again, this is a botanical. And then we also wanted to test the Preaxorhizenium. And then I just wanted to show you the different frat groups. You can see which ones are different from one another. If there was a range of rates on the bottle or package of these products, then we selected the medium rate. So for example, for Badge X2, they give a range of 1 to 3 pounds per acre. So we did 2 pounds per acre. And then you can sort of also see if there's a maximum annual that you can apply for these different products. There's not a max for the biologicals, but definitely for the coppers, because we can get buildup. And then there's a max also for Problad and Preaxor. And then the REI, so how soon after can you go into these farms after you spray these products? The biologicals and the Problad are only 4 hours, 48 hours for the coppers and 12 hours for Preaxor. We used the full PPE when we applied all of these products. So full Tyvek suits, respirators, gloves, the whole deal. We used 3.75 liter steel backpack sprayers, which you can see in the photo. And then in terms of spray volume, there's a little dial on the nozzle and it goes from 1 to 6, and we just chose the medium. We were getting a really good volume at that 3 setting, so that's what we used for all the farms. And then you have a choice of the little nozzle attachments that backpack sprayer comes with. And we tried out a bunch of different ones. And we found that the one that has the vents sort of facing upwards worked the best because that allowed us to get up underneath the leaves. So it really improved spray coverage. And you can see that in the picture, we're getting a really nice angle up underneath the plant, which is really critical. Okay, fungicide application. Each treatment block received 2 sprays of the designated fungicide at a 5-week interval. So that ended up being early May and then June. We did something a little different for Preaxor. We wanted to test two different spray schemes at a higher incidence. And basically we wanted to know what the difference was if we applied just one spray of Preaxor compared to a combination of two sprays of Preaxor with a preventative badge in between. We wanted to know if we would get significantly different or improved control with that sort of, that combination of sprays over a short interval of time. So for Preaxor A, that was the single application of Preaxor, which we did after that first evaluation at week 0, that was early May. And then for that second treatment, Preaxor B, we applied Preaxor at week 0 in early May, badge SC at week 2 in late May, and then Preaxor again at week 5 in June. 2022, we assessed 12 trees per treatment block, and we assessed them at weekly intervals. 2023, we changed our design just slightly. We decided we wanted to get a bigger sample size, so we increased to 15 trees per treatment. And we weren't seeing too much of a difference week to week, so we moved to bi-weekly assessments. Evaluations were done at week 0, so that's prior to any application of fungicides all the way through week 15. And for each one of our study trees, we assessed a randomly selected branch at low, mid, and upper canopies, and they were assessed for both CLR incidence as well as leaf retention. And then lastly, we estimated spray costs. So how many dollars per hour it costed to spray these products, the number of hours needed to spray 1 acre, the products used, which included a fungicide and also a surfactant. I should add that we included widespread with all the products we applied, and then operation of the sprayers that included the cost of gas and oil. Okay, getting into some results. So graph on the left is from our 2022 trial, and then on the right we have 2023. The darker bars are pre-application, so that's before we applied any fungicide, and that's at week 0. And then the lighter colored bars, which are paired with it, are post-application. So we assessed those about a week after we applied the second fungicide. So for the preventatives, that ended up being week 6, and then for the 2 Preaxor applications, it ended up being week 8. So on the y-axis, we have CLR incidence, and then on the x-axis, we have the products used. For 2022, you can see that there are a couple little stars over the badge pre and post, and that just shows that there was a significant decrease in CLR incidence after 2 sprays of badge. We also saw a decrease with Fungicide, but it was not significant. That's what the little NS stands for, is not significant. We saw a slight increase in Serenade. We saw a slight increase in incidence for Serenade, and then we didn't see any difference for the ProBlad in 2022. In 2023, we added a couple products. So we ended up with 2 coppers, 2 biologicals, the ProBlad, and then the 2 different spray schemes of the Preaxor. So similar to 2022, we did see a decrease for both badge and Fungicide, although they were not significant. We saw pretty much no difference at all for the double nickel and Serenade. And then we saw a significant increase in rust when we applied the ProBlad. And perhaps the most interesting is that we saw a very significant decrease after applying just a single spray of Preaxor. We started at about 13% in that plot, and 1 spray of Preaxor brought it all the way down to less than 1%. And then similarly, for the combination of 2 Preaxor sprays and 1 badge spray, we saw a significant decrease from 8% all the way down to less than 1%. And then getting into results for duration of protection. So we compared fungicide treatment 7 to 10 weeks after the final application. So it was 10 weeks after the final spray in 2022 and 7 weeks after the final spray in 2023. The little dashed line is our 5% threshold, just as a reference point. So in 2022, you can see that the 2 badge products were not significantly different from one another. So that's what the 2 little A's stand for. Those were statistically the same, but they kept the rust below 5%. In contrast, Serenade was much higher at the end of 10 weeks. and it was up to about 10%, and that was not different from the ProBlad, which was also up to about 14%. And then 2023, again, we saw the two copper products keeping rust below 5%. The two biological products, not different from one another, but they were not successful in keeping rust below 5%. And then the ProBlad was quite a bit higher than everything else. And Preaxor, both schemes kept the rust really, really low, less than 2%. And then I just wanted to show you what they look like over time. This is the average across all farms for 2022 and 2023. From 2022, you can see that after we applied the first fungicide at week 0, you start to see that decrease. And then it goes up a little bit. And then at week 5, we apply that second spray and you see the drop off again. And it sort of continues over time like that. But the badge and the coside seem to work really well, keeping it below 5%. And then you can see that the biological and the botanical, you get that slow increase over time. And then sort of similar for 2023, except we had that Preaxor added in there and it worked really well, whether we applied it once or whether we applied it twice in combination with badge. They both knocked out CLR at week 1 and kept it really low throughout the entire duration of the experiment. And then we also looked at leaf retention. So we found significantly higher leaf retention in the coppers and the Serenade treatment in 2022. And then we found significantly higher leaf retention in the badge and Preaxor treatment in 2023. So a little bit of different results between the 2 years, but I think it's really important to point out that we had different starting incidents. So in 2022, our starting incidence was quite low. It was only 3%, whereas in 2023, it was a bit higher at 8%. So again, these preventatives, the biologicals and the coppers are going to work a lot better at a low starting incidence. And I think that's why we saw a significant increase in leaf retention for 2022 compared to 2023 with these products. And then results for spray costs. So we found that a single spray of fungicide ranged anywhere from $103 to $228 per acre. And then in the table, you can see that we have an average across 8 farms. The 2 copper products ended up being the cheapest to apply, so $125 per acre. Then came Serenade at $137, and Preaxor at $139, double nickel $167, ProBlad almost $200, and then that combination of 2 Preaxor and 1 badge was almost $400. So summary of results. The 2 coppers, badge and coside, both reduced incidence to below 5%, and they also significantly increased leaf retention. We estimate that they can provide protection for anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks. I'm giving a range because, again, it's going to depend on weather and coverage, the time of year, a lot of different factors. The 2 coppers were also most cost effective at $126 per acre. And then Serenade, double nickel, and ProBlad either had no effect or significantly higher incidence, increased leaf retention at low starting incidence, and they were the most expensive products at $138 to $198 an acre. For the 2 Preaxor treatments, both of them, whether it was 1 spray or three sprays, significantly reduced incidence, less than 2%. And they also both significantly increased leaf retention. We estimate that those products will give about 10 to 12 weeks protection. And since we found really similar results for both spray strategies, obviously 1 spray at $140 an acre is more cost effective than the combination of 3 sprays at almost $400 per acre. We did see a little bit of variation within frat groups, in particular badge X2 versus coside. The badge did tend to perform better than the coside, and we think this is probably related to the fact that badge has 2 active ingredients compared to coside's 1. So the 2 different coppers, copper hydroxide is what both of the products have, and these are smaller particles that are rapidly released. And they give really good adhesion and good coverage, and they're a little bit more difficult to wash off. In contrast, badge X2 also has this copper oxychloride, and it has large particles with a slow, prolonged release and a better duration of control. So these are just some things that growers might want to consider when they're selecting a fungicide. There are differences in efficacy since the products have different active ingredients. In this case, they both have the same REI, so you might just consider efficacy and also cost, but these two have actually the same cost. And this is in contrast to Serenade and Double Nickel, where we saw similar efficacy, but Serenade was definitely the more cost-effective of the two. And then I didn't show the data because we largely got the same results for all of our farms, with one exception. The Hilo farm actually showed lower efficacy of coppers related to the, relative to the biologicals. So the two copper products, Badge and Coside, actually performed not as well as the Serenade and the Double Nickel. And we think this is probably because this farm has a really high rainfall. And so it could be that the wash off resulted in coppers being less effective at this farm. Coppers are known for having issues with wash off. It's been reported in Colombia, you can get up to 50% of the particles washed off just after the first rainfall. So growers might want to consider which fungicides are best for them, depending on where the farm is located and what the weather's like. If you're in a really rainy area, the biologicals might provide a little bit better protection than the coppers. So a lot of things to consider here. But in general, I would say that Preaxorzemium is the most effective and provides the longest duration of protection. Some things that perhaps are limitations, you can only apply it twice per year, and the last spray has to be done at least 45 days before harvest. You also have to rotate it with fungicides and other frat groups to prevent resistance, and this product's incompatible with Bavaria. The coppers were the second most effective, 6 to 8 weeks protection. There is potential for buildup of copper in your soils and tissue, so you don't want to apply it month after month. And coppers are prone to wash off, so it's something to consider if you're in a rainy area. The biologicals can be used to keep CLR low, but only for a short period of time, maybe 2 to 4 weeks. And they are only going to be effective at very low incidence. They do also have a little bit of a higher cost relative to the coppers. And then lastly, we found that Problad Verde was not well suited to control rust in Hawaii. Overall, we saw poor performance and a pretty high cost. And then it's also not compatible with Bavaria, so that's something else to consider. So lastly, I just wanted to say that we have been working really hard at getting resistant varieties to Hawaii and tested. Lisa Keith's lab, Tracy Matsumoto's lab, people at Heart, Andrea, a lot of people are working on this problem. But even when we get these resistant varieties, I think it's important to realize that we're still going to have to spray fungicides. So fungicides are always going to be an important part of your IPM strategy. So it's really important that you understand what you're applying, why you're applying it, and how to optimize your results. In a lot of different areas around the world, they use a combination of preventatives and curatives, and they rotate those to manage rust. So in places like Colombia, Brazil, Kenya, they might only do 2 to 4 or 6 sprays a year. So 2 applications of a curative and 2 to 4 applications of a preventative are rotated. And then I wanted to just give you some ideas for what you might want to do for your rotation program, depending on what kind of farm you have. If you have a conventional farm and you have a low starting incidence, you could do a Preaxor early in the season, maybe February, and then a second one in June, so that you get that done before you start harvesting. And then you can alternate with a couple sprays of Badge, so 4 sprays overall, if you have a low incidence. If you're a conventional farm with a little bit of a higher starting incidence, you could do 2 sprays of Preaxor and maybe 3 or 4 sprays of a preventative in between. Organic farms, you're going to be a little bit more limited in what you can apply, but I still think it's possible to control rust. It just might be that you have a higher threshold, right? So maybe your low threshold is like 10% or 15%, and you're going to have to spray more often. So maybe you might need to do 3 applications of a copper and 3 applications of a biological. And then if you're at even higher starting incidence, maybe you have to do 4 applications of a copper and 4 of a biological. So just something to think about. The timing is going to be really important. And then we didn't test oxidate, but I think it is really useful as a knockdown. We've talked about using it either before or after pruning, and I think that is a great idea, so that you can, again, start your season really low. And that is all I have for you today. I appreciate your attention and support of all the growers. We had a lot of people help in the field. Dr. Lisa Keith gave some great suggestions and guidance early in the study. Suzanne Schreiner of SHAC has been critical for administrative support. And then we got funding through a USDA NIFA Specialty Crops Research Initiative grant and also support through USDA PBARC. Thank you all for listening and happy to answer any questions.